Welcome to the first Tes Magazine Education Insights panel. These regular discussions between school leaders, education researchers and key figures in the education industry are designed to highlight and find solutions for the key challenges facing schools. For this session, we are lucky enough to be at Firth Park Academy in Sheffield, part of AET Schools. Joining me for this session, Cathie Paine, CEO of REAch2 Academy Trust, which is the largest primary multi-academy trust in the country. Rebecca Boomer-Clark, CEO of Academies Enterprise Trust, one of the largest multi-academy trusts in the UK. Professor Becky Francis, Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, one of the leading education research bodies in the world. And Caroline Wright, Director General of the British Education Suppliers Association, which represents more than 400 commercial companies in the education industry. The area we're going to focus on first is COVID's impact on academic attainment. Cathie, let's come to you first. What impact has COVID had on the primary age group? Where are the problems worse and how bad are those problems?
Okay, so if we start with the older children first, that's the positive part of the story. We're finding that the children in Year 5 and Year 6 have fared the best. I was in a school in Barnet a couple of weeks ago and was really impressed with the quality of the written work. It's been writing, I think, that has been the hardest to maintain in terms of the remote learning, but the catch-up that's gone on and the quality of the teaching that happened both online and now that schools are back, I could see no difference in the quality of the written work from the Year 6s from any time pre-COVID, which was, clearly really, really reassuring. Unfortunately, the picture seems to deteriorate the younger the children. So we're finding with our Year 2 children that, if we look at their journey through school, they haven't had a single undisrupted year since they began. And so the attainment in terms of their reading and their writing and their maths is quite far below what we've seen in previous years. Obviously, the younger the children, the harder it was to maintain that momentum with remote and online learning. And then in the early years, what the early years practitioners and the early years leads are telling me, and I saw for myself in a recent visit to one of our schools in Stafford, in Staffordshire itself, there's really great collaboration between the schools, and the feeling there and right across the trust is that the children in the early years are finding it very hard to self-regulate, and as a ballpark really are now, we're only a couple of weeks away from the summer term, where they might perhaps have expected children to have been when they came into reception in September. So that personal, social, emotional ability to regulate, their communication and language isn't where it would be at this stage of the year. But it's actually things like physical development, because of course children in the lockdowns of that age, they were 2 or 3 at the time, weren't getting out to toddler groups, they weren't involved in nursery education. So all elements of those early learning goals have been impacted. Of course, with these children, we've now got longer to plug the gaps, and I'm seeing incredible practice going on, that over and above doesn't come close to describe it. So, we're optimistic, but the marks on these children are there.
I guess when they go up to secondary, Rebecca, that would be your equivalent of your present Year 7s who've had the most disruption. So the Year 4 to Year 7 in terms of haven't gone through the SATs, haven't had that SATs preparation that the children would normally have had. Does that impact how you assess those children coming in? What sort of gaps are you seeing?
Yeah, it's definitely Year 7 and Year 8. And we're finding actually Year 8 more so than Year 7. You get that kind of natural uplift of going to secondary school, which means that I think that there's a real sense that Year 7 have had a fresh start and a full run at it in a way that Year 8 didn't. And obviously they both were impacted in terms of SATs. I think it's really interesting to actually go back to the centre assessed grades. So what we found, if you go back to 2021 centre assessed grades, is that in primary you've seen a decline across our primary schools from the 2019 levels of performance, and in secondary you've seen an increase. And I think that's fascinating in terms of where are these children actually, and so we've really worked hard to think about how can we assess in a way that's meaningful, that can be anchored, And so we've done standardised testing in English and maths through all year groups, Key Stage 2 right the way through to Key Stage 4. But actually the data set that we're placing the most emphasis on is reading age data, because we just felt real. Yeah. And when we did the baseline, so we did all children from year 2 through to year 11, and we did that in September. And over 50% of our 33,000 children were below their chronological reading age. And I just think that it's a really interesting space that I think we need to understand much more about at a national level. What's really encouraging though is that in just a few short months, so in the period between September and February, we've improved quite significantly, so 8 percentage points across the trust in that period of time. So we've gone from 44% being below their chronological reading age to 52%. Which sounds small, but actually in that period of time, they've gained they've made progress 4 times that which would be expected. And so I'm really encouraged that if we focus on the right things and that we assess things which are meaningful and can be meaningfully compared, actually there is, these young people, they've missed out on a lot, but they've also acquired new skills. And so it's really important, I think, that we're positive about how, what needs sort of different for them, but actually the new skills and potential that's inherent within them too. We found coming back that classrooms were really quite quiet. It's just that ability to sort of sit and discuss and sort of work comfortably with your peers. And for some children, that getting used to just socially being back in school was really challenging. How do you measure that meaningfully? And so we've sort of been quite cautious about using assessment data, but where we have, we've wanted it to be grounded in something really tangible and practical, which is where reading came good for us. When
you say 44% of children, what would that have been in 2019, 2018? Do you have baseline data or an assumption of what that would have been?
I mean, it's the first time that across AET that we've done extensive reading age tests, so we don't have a baseline. What I can tell you is sort of going into it intuitively, I thought that it would probably be just above 50%, but that was just sort of an intuitive sense. I know that colleagues within Trust were surprised by how low it was. I think that this is something which has perhaps been exacerbated by COVID and its disruption, but I actually think it's something which we haven't shone a sufficient spotlight on for many years. And it really is that literacy literally unlocks the curriculum for every child. And so were we surprised? I think it's shocking data at one level, but were we surprised? I'm not sure that we were surprised, no.
Does that reflect the national picture, do you think, Becky, that you're seeing in the EEF data? Are we these sort of peaks of impact in year 2 and this year 7 and 8 and where the reading is impacted? Does that reflect in your data?
Yeah, I mean, we now have access to a raft of evidence, actually, and there are a lot of high-quality studies working in this area, tracking the impact of the pandemic on learning loss over the period, and indeed learning recovery, as Becca's saying. And it's important to say we'll be trying to collate that evidence over the summer to try to bring those findings together and make them meaningful, because many of these studies are using different data points, looking at different year groups and so forth, have started at different points during the pandemic and so forth. There can be some sort of apparent inconsistencies in the findings, and we'll try to make sense of those. I think the key takeaways are that overall we see this learning loss as we would anticipate. We're also beginning to see recovery in different areas. It does seem from the findings overall, Jon, as though primary has been affected worse, and the early years, as we were hearing too. But also that's where some of the most significant catch-up seems to be happening as well. Obviously, we've got this latest evidence from Renaissance and EPI's very latest findings that actually reading seems to be a core area of challenge. And we're also seeing, as we would predict, that catch-up seems to be taking place overall, but for socially disadvantaged kids, not only did they lose the most during the pandemic, and that evidence is very clear across the different studies we're collating, but also that their catch-up seems to be slower. And of course, we could hypothesize a whole range of explanations for that, but it does show where we need to go hardest and fastest in terms of thinking about recovery support.
Does that reflect, Caroline, in your members when they're talking about usage of their platforms? We know that just post-lockdown, the use of commercial products became free and everyone reported a huge uptick. And then since then, a lot of them have gone back to paid subscription services. But do they see this in their data, in the usage of their apps, and are they feeding that into their product development, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think whilst obviously listening to Cathie and Rebecca talk particularly about sort of what's happening in schools, the best place to talk about that, but actually in terms of what we carry out research of schools, we feed in what our members tell us, and it's been really interesting. So our companies, 400 odd companies provided, I think it was £24 million of digital resources free of charge into schools just in the first 3 months of lockdown alone. And many of them carried that on all the way through to schools, went back in the September. And we did see throughout lockdown and moving back into schools a huge uptick in terms of the use of digital resources. But really interestingly, and I think it just reflects, I think I'm a little bit more positive about the situation in the sense of feeling really confident about what teachers are doing, because actually what we're seeing in primary schools particularly is a decline in the use of digital resources and a move back in terms of purchasing to play equipment, hands-on sort of sensory equipment. And I think that very much reflects that the teachers know where the children have missed out on some of those really important social skills and are adapting their own classrooms and schools effectively. So I think having seen that data moving forward, I think that's a sign, hopefully, that the schools are knowing what they need to do with their pupils. But I think one of the other challenges, particularly as we move out of the COVID period, we saw a huge investment in infrastructure and digital devices, the government's device scheme. Different views on how well that went, but there was a big injection of devices into schools. But we still have, actually, I think it's 43% of primaries and 20% of secondary schools worried and unhappy about the infrastructure capacity they have in the classrooms. And I think there's 1.2 million obsolete devices even now in schools, so the kind of devices that can't be used because they just don't work anymore. And we're going to have to see, to maintain the progress that's been made, a continued investment in the equipment, infrastructure in schools, so that schools can carry on with some of the gains they've made.
It's interesting, both Cathie and Rebecca have pointed out this social and emotional side, and you have as well. It's not easy to track that, is it, Becky, in terms of, like, we've got reading age tests, we've got numeracy tests. How do you test? For you, the question is, how do you test for those social emotional impacts? And for Caroline, how do those products that aim to help that, how do they prove they work? It's a difficult problem. So, I mean, to you first.
Well, there are outcome measures for social and emotional learning, but you're absolutely right. Within the sort of context of the pandemic, there's been very little tracking of those measures, including mental health as well. And we know anecdotally, I'm sure colleagues around the room will agree that this has been a core challenge that teachers are reporting on. And parents are reporting on as well, of course. But in terms of the sort of numeric evidence for that, we have very little.
Do you try and track that at a school level? Is it, what sort of tools do you have other than teacher expertise, which really shouldn't be talked down, because teachers are amazing at spotting when a child is in trouble or a child is struggling. But do you have any metric for this?
I think it's about the aggregation of different sources of evidence that sort of gives you the sort of richest insight. And I'm quite sceptical. I think it's quite dangerous to actually go down the route of putting too significant a reliance upon one source of data. So, I mean, there are platforms like AS Steer, which is used in some of our schools, which looks at anticipating challenges ahead for individual young people from responses to sort of survey questions. But that in isolation, nothing I think can take the place of actually the relationship. And one of the things that we've talked about quite extensively is actually resetting that culture, making sure that it's a positive, safe, affirming culture in all of our schools, making sure that every child is known, that we understand the context. The pandemic was very uneven in its distribution of impact, and young people and families that were hardest hit. Some of that's visible to us. I suspect that much of that, it is invisible to us to a degree, and it's not over yet as we sort of see the challenging sort of fiscal context that we're sort of operating in. And so I think I'm mindful of saying, yes, it's really important that we use data, but actually what's more important, I think, is that every child feels known, and that we understand them as individuals. And I think that so often that, sadly, the most reliable data is that which is retrospective, and you put together the patterns which then sort of say, well, actually, this point of crisis, could it have been anticipated? And then I think you get into really difficult territory, because this is hard and complex work. And I think to sort of oversimplify it, to sort of say that necessarily we are in a place that we can have a stronger sort of predictive capability. I've got reservations about how far we want to go down that track.
Is it more complex at primary, Cathie, in the sense that the children might not have the, especially with the reading problems and the language problems that you're seeing coming through as a result of COVID, they can't articulate those problems as easy as they may have done? I know it's always a struggle for a 5-year-old to articulate their feeling, but are you finding that area tougher?
It is tougher. It is tougher for teachers and support staff, and I think, we all know that when children behave in a way that isn't acceptable, it's trying to tell us something. And so the deterioration in what we're seeing in children's self-regulation is telling this sort of story that Bex is describing, that, I'm not okay, things aren't okay. But we also are finding, which I think is immensely positive, that because of the strong relationships that exist in schools, that children are finding that mental health now is something that they can talk about. Well-being is not a subject that's off limits, perhaps in the way it might have felt years ago. This is an open door conversation. One of our schools in Harlow has employed a full-time therapist who is seeing children on a sort of open door basis, and staff. That was what their head teacher believed was needed, so that's what he did. We're using programs such as Thrive, which clearly is that restorative, therapeutic approach to behaviour, and there is a real focus across the trust. We've implemented mindfulness in many of the classrooms with teachers who are trained as mindfulness practitioners. We held 3 times a week in the lockdowns mindfulness sessions for staff, and I think it was 250 people came on the first Zoom call that I led. In helping, and it was from right across the trust, support staff, teachers, leaders, who just knew that they needed something. And of course, the more that we say that that's okay to say I'm not okay, the more we keep using that language in our conversations as leaders of organisations, then the more that filters down, so that warm, just the relationships that Bex was talking about, which is, you can be fully yourself, where you belong here, you're included, you turn up however you are, and it's okay. That's what we want. We want that culture in our schools that will help children to feel I've got people here when I walk through the door that can put me back on the right track, and I can be open and honest about how I'm feeling. Interestingly, we've just done our first ever children's survey, and in spite of everything, 82% of children are saying that they're very happy at school. So, we're working on the several thousand that said they weren't, but that they are. I know we're never going to forget working in our sector. Just children are so resilient. They've got this bounce back thing that is quite, as adults we can be quite envious of in many ways. And
definitely.
Yeah.
Caroline, obviously there's a lot of products in this space, both Cathie and Rebecca have mentioned a couple. Obviously in the area of mental health we need to be very careful about what companies are claiming when they go into schools. In your view, how should commercial companies be approaching this? Because obviously there's solutions to be offered, but how should they market themselves?
That's a really good question. And actually, just before I answer that, just as I think the only non-teacher, non-academic in the room, just thank you. What you do kind of to actually help children as they've gone back into school is incredible. And I think, you know, as a parent, you often don't know how to help support children. So I think it's incredible that in schools, children do feel confident and able, in the main, to be able to talk about their feelings and you helping them to do that. So I think it's really important. But they're absolutely, I think we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years a much larger focus from companies in the education space wanting to be able to prove the outcomes and evidence their products and services. And that's not just digital, it's across the piece. But you know, 5 or 6 years ago, they didn't really know how. So actually, that's a generalisation. There were some that have done very, very sort of thorough work. But for lots of the smaller companies, and particularly in the digital world, the vast majority of companies are startups or are growing by the nature of it. We partnered with an organisation called Educate that originally founded from the University College of London, received some European Union development funding to actually help education companies carry out proper evidence and impact analysis of their products and services. And since 2017, we've taken 300 companies through that process so that they know how to, as commercial organisations, carry out quality sort of academic level research and impact analysis on their products. So absolutely, as schools, I would say to schools, you ask the questions, ask to see the analysis, interrogate it. And I know that's hard when you haven't got much time, but it's really important to make sure that it's got efficacy, the efficacy of the products. We've actually, through BESA, we've launched something called Lended, because everybody's heard about the cupboard of shame, where kind of a school bought something and actually it doesn't connect to the Wi-Fi, it doesn't work, or it's just not suitable for the children in the school. And that's the companies that put their products on that platform that schools can browse have to make available their product for free of charge to the schools to try, so they can actually see if it works in their setting. They also have to have an evaluation, as well as putting links to kind of whatever research they've carried out on their products, teacher case studies. So real teachers, because we know teachers trust teachers. So that's kind of a really, so that's for across more than just well-being. But in particular on the well-being issue, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, British education, I think we do ourselves down in the UK and we're sort of very focused on what we could do better, but it's worth remembering that the rest of the world still looks to the UK for the quality of the education we offer. And as a part of that, as well as our schools and colleges, we see lots of countries around the world wanting to use British education products and services too. So we, you know, before COVID, would be taking our companies out to about a dozen countries a year, and in some very high performing jurisdictions with quite a lot of exam pressure, there has been a history of kind of poor and low student mental health and well-being, and our companies have got quite a lot of experience of working in those countries with school systems on trying to support children. So, you know, as we're seeing COVID-related pressures here, actually a number of those companies have already developed some products that they can adapt and use in the context here. So there are, and actually at the BET, which is the world's largest EdTech event that happened last week, you did see a growing number of companies with well-being services, not just for the children. I think it's also important to mention teachers. So kind of, you know, an awful lot of pressure on teachers, actually how to help teacher well-being and motivation as well, because I think that's a massive challenge of supporting the staff in schools moving forward. So it is an area.
You must be looking on to this, Becky, and think the EEF is the organisation that teachers look to for validation. Obviously, you can't validate every product in the market, just as you can't validate every intervention that goes on in schools that Rebecca or Cathie may have used for their literacy and numeracy catch-up. Where is your remit start and finish in terms of validating and giving schools some trust in what they're using, and where do you want schools to take the initiative, really?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and I wanted to come in on Caroline's point actually, because I think you're absolutely right, Caroline. You know, the English education system is really innovative, and it's right that we look to internationally for that innovation. But we know that within that innovation, there's good practice and bad practice, and there's still a lot of snake oil out there. There's also a lot of snake oil companies and products that claim to be evidence-based, and I think that's an increasing trend that we're seeing, the claim to evidence wherever we look. So the question is, what is that evidence, as you're indicating, and how do teachers discern between this sort of very vibrant market? We've often been asked whether we would kite mark, but you're exactly right, John. You know, there's going to be an infinite challenge. And also one of the careful messages that we curate at the EF is that, to quote Dylan William, most things can work somewhere. The challenge is whether they work everywhere, and a part of that explanation is also about implementation and fidelity. So even where you have very strong evidence-led products and programs that care to resist complacency and think about how those things are interrogated and practiced, it remains important. I think that what we can do, and very much the EF's role here, is to distill active ingredients, which we're trying to do through our guidance reports, again drawing on our resources like the famous Teaching and Learning Toolkit and our other evidence reviews, to distill those ingredients that sit behind, that teachers can then use our resources to say, well, does this product speak to the evidence? What am I looking for here? And also to be encouraging that research literacy so that teachers are equipped to assess the warrant and the claims that different products and offers are making.
In the MAT sector, obviously the decisions you make scale very quickly. So when you're making purchasing decisions, do you trial in a single school first, or you mentioned the Renaissance Learning assessments? Is that something that you've had a history with, so you scale it up very quickly for this purpose, or do you sometimes confident enough to go, no, this is something for us? It's a difficult balancing act, I imagine. Yeah,
it is, and I think my natural instinct is to pilot something and to sort of make the mistakes on a smaller scale first, and before you take something to scale. Some things like the NGRT, the reading test, there's such a secure evidence base that actually that was quite a straightforward decision to say, no, we're going to scale this. Mm-hmm. But generally, I think that it's really, I mean, it's amazing actually, the range of products that are now available. And there's a sense that there are some where you can say, absolutely, this feels like, for all of these reasons, a market-leading product. But it still might not, to the point around implementation, be the right solution in a very different context or setting. And I think it's, a school has to be ready to run with something. And it's all too easy, to sort of diagnose something at scale, and then poorly implemented, it has sometimes an actively unhelpful impact. So I'm really cautious about what we implement at scale. But equally, given our sort of size and scale, there's a lot that we can gain in terms of sort of intelligent procurement, which has real benefits for our schools. And so it's very much a sort of mixed economy for us. But being bold enough to make decisions that is something, once proven, does work, that we can scale it up quickly.
Do you find this similar in your trust? And if we add in pedagogical approaches to this as well, because you could easily buy in a pedagogical approach as much as a product that was assessment based or a tracking data tool. How much do you have to trust the head teacher? Do they come to you? How does that process work?
We try and walk the line, just as Bex has described, between believing, and we know it to be true, that the head teachers are best placed to make decisions about what their school community needs. We serve children from incredibly different social backgrounds and very dispersed geographical backgrounds. Schools that have got 70 children in rural Suffolk to schools in London with 1,400 children on school sites, so with 60 different languages spoken. It's very difficult and would be completely wrong to say there is a one-size-fits-all approach to schools that are so very diverse. That said, we know that one of the benefits of being in a strong trust is that the financial resources are used wisely and they're used efficiently and they're used effectively, so that it can, where money is saved through procurement, it's redeployed into where it's needed, which is at the classroom. So there are aspects where we have said, we've got one assessment system. It would be, a fairly meaningless approach to something as crucial as assessing children to not know when we're looking at trust-wide data if we're comparing like with like. So there's been certain sort of quick wins and easy wins where heads and teachers have been very accepting of the need for a unified system. So I think really on the whole we try and walk the line. We did try and implement a pedagogical approach several years ago with find what works and scale it up and implement it, and we piloted it. It worked with a small number of schools. As soon as you try and do anything with schools that are at different stages of their journey, some that are outstanding and trying to maintain, some that have just come into the trust as schools that were previously inadequate, I think you're into quite rocky territory, because heads find themselves in kind of initiative overload. What they need to do is gatekeep the school development journey. And I think as a trust we've tried to be a kind of cornerstone that supports the buildings of the schools themselves, but really letting the heads be the architects of that, which I think is what drew me into the job and motivates our head teachers to be in the job.
Obviously with all these products working in schools, Caroline, these product owners have an incredible wealth of data. And we've seen Renaissance Learning share the data with the government, and there's some really good stats on that. Do you think the commercial sector is open enough with schools about the data they have, and allowing schools to use that data in a obviously sensitive and confidential way to inform what they're doing better?
That's a really good question. I think individual companies need to work with the individual schools they work with, because ultimately they're helping support the schools. So there are obviously the GDPR and the right safeguards in place for data security, but within a school, absolutely the suppliers should be working with schools to make sure they do that. And I think the most effective suppliers do. And yeah, you do see, so I think one of the really helpful things that suppliers can offer is, because they are working very often with hundreds or thousands of schools, actually building up that data and being able to report, things like what kids are reading with Renaissance and others. So I think it's an area where suppliers would want to work hand in hand with schools, and you can see them doing that. But sometimes it's also the pressures on both sides of how much time and how bought in, given all the other pressures schools can be at the moment, and suppliers. But it's definitely an area that it should be focused on.
And so, Becky, I'm going to come to you now and say, what are the dangers here? So I've asked Caroline, how much data can we have? Can we have it all? But I imagine you're going to say, well, hang on, what's the quality of the data? What's the tipping point where data becomes you're led by the data rather than being led by what you're seeing in front of you?
I think Beck's made some very good points about the data earlier. We need data, of course, that's your starting point, and that helps your diagnosis. But the teacher inflection and using your own data alongside, national data and local data and so on, is definitely important. And I suppose that kind of resonates with a broader message from the EEF. We need evidence, of course, that's your starting point, robust research evidence. But we then need teachers to be able to use their professional lens, reflecting their expertise about the local context and their kids' needs in order to inflect that evidence. I think that's probably where our kind of broad guidance, we've got our famous pupil premium guidance, for example, where we talk about a tiered approach, actually works probably beyond the pupil premium too. So the sort of messages there are start with your high quality teaching. We know that it's high quality teaching that actually makes the best progress for children and particularly disadvantaged kids, as was noted in the white paper, and we'll be talking about that in a minute, I'm sure. So you start from that point, thinking about development then and support for your teachers, recruitment and retention and so forth, but also perpetual learning, how that's delivered with quality. These are, they're always the most important starting point and area of direction. Then you've got, with your diagnosis from the data, your identification of particular areas of challenge, perhaps for particular pupil groups, and that's where evidence-led programs and products can be very, very helpful. And then you've got your whole school context and the how to support kids' readiness for for learning in some of the ways, again, that we've been hearing, which also are very important and legitimate to expend resource. But thinking about it in that tiered way almost returns people to kind of best principles and thinking about their professional lens and how to apply it, rather than being kind of dazzled or jostled by the availability of products in the space.
It's a good time then to move the discussion to funding. And I guess the difficulty for you, Caroline, is that because some of these products were free and then become paid for, and obviously education is a public good, how does the school justify the cost of paid for? And we should talk about this in the context of the Oak National Academy being funded as a free resource and covering quite a lot of the basis of what we're talking about. How do we sort of talk about that in a sensible, mature way?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think just to set the context for it, we carry out surveys annually of more than thousands of schools, and it's a typical response of more than 1,200 schools. So we've been doing that every year for a long time. And really worryingly, despite the more money has gone into schools, but obviously there have been huge pressures on how schools use that funding. So when you look at the actual money that goes onto the resources in schools, ICT and non-ICT, at the very, very maximum, it's maximum of 5% of a school budget. So in real terms, that's £55 per primary school pupil and £49 per secondary school on average. And we have seen, even with the injection during COVID, the expenditure on resources in schools has gone down. It's expected for this year to go down to 2015, 2016 levels. So to put that into context, for a secondary school, that's about £62,000 per secondary school, going down to an estimate of £49,000. Now that's kind of a really worrying situation when we've all talked about the pressures that are on schools to help support pupils. That obviously you need teachers, you need kind of a safe and welcoming environment, but you also need some resources of some kind to be able to inspire and the children there. So that's a big challenge. But then moving on to the discussion about the funding of resources, I've been really struck by this conversation alone about schools making choices for themselves, and the moment you try and centralise something or roll out something, it doesn't work. And for me, and for what teachers are telling us in our research, we carried out a research just last month of more than 600 schools. Only 14% of schools are in favour of kind of a DFE or kind of centralised resources being made available to them. The vast majority, sort of more than 63%, don't want it at all. And they want to be able to choose their own resources. Now, it's how you deliver that, because in a state education system, I think that term free is a bit of a misnomer, because a school gets funding from government to do what they need to do with it, or government provides a resource. It's all paid for somewhere, whether the government procures from a company to make available a resource that's then put on a platform, or a school chooses the resources they want to use. And actually what schools are telling us, and where we've seen success work, is where schools have the freedom and choice to choose the resources they want to use. And actually I worry that moving to a centralised system isn't really about making available resources, it's about cutting costs by making available a smaller number of resources. Now that's what I really want to make clear, is that's not to say what Oak and others during the pandemic, I've talked about the £24 million that our companies made available, that was a response that was absolutely right and really valuable. So I think those resources should remain available absolutely for schools to use as they want. But moving forwards, I think we need to listen to the challenges that we're all talking about. What do schools want and need? And when we ask them what are the biggest challenges, getting free stuff, centralised sort of free curriculum resources from the central government does not come anywhere near sort of the top 5, 6, 7 on the list. It's budgets in schools generally, it's teacher, CPD and training, and it's those infrastructure challenges. So I think helping schools, and the white paper does address some of those, but I think they're the key challenges, and then putting the trust in teachers and giving them adequate funding to be able to choose what they use and where.
On that point about budget being the biggest concern, what's the reality of the financing around schools at the moment?
Well, I mean, the money is up on paper, but there is still a real complex issues affecting schools. I mean, there's the rise in national insurance, pension costs. We're seeing about a 25% increase in building costs, any work done on school buildings. But I think the extreme and ongoing demand that's being placed on budgets that's been so unpredictable is that of staff absence. There's a school that even this week has got 25% of the staff off with either COVID or long COVID. And the impact of that, of course, is not just on supply costs, it's the leadership costs involved of perhaps non-teaching roles who've got specific areas of responsibility who are then involved in covering classes. And because nobody could have predicted the waves of the pandemic that have come and kept coming, I think just when schools think they can start to plan ahead and the budget situation will start to smooth again, it just hasn't. And they've been struck by another kind of huge bout of absence. So I think that is the main demand being placed in terms of budgets. The other is around special educational needs funding. And so, the aspects that refer to that in both the white paper and of course the green paper are really welcomed, because we know that those complex needs and high needs are only more prolific across the sector now than ever. And schools will meet children's needs. They won't let them have needs that are unmet. But the sort of waiting game of EHCPs and the children waiting to be assessed is really putting a cost on both staff resource, the children's provision and the budget overall. And
in terms of the salary makeup of the school, obviously you've got the 30,000 starting salary come in. How do you manage a situation that's becoming much more transient with staffing, in terms of, we know that we're missing ITT targets, so we might skew slightly less on NQT or ECTs as they're called now. How do you assess that, and what impact does staffing have on your budget, considering it's such a huge part of a budget?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a significant part. It's the most important factor if you're thinking about affordability. But I think it's also really helpful to think about it in the context of time, because I just don't think that we quantify time with the degree of precision that we should. So when we were talking earlier about whether or not we sort of buy products, let's talk about curriculum products. And when I first came to AET, I sort of diagnosed a really acute case of not invented here syndrome. And I continually come back and say, well, should we build it ourselves? Should we buy it, or should we partner with somebody else? And actually, how much time would it actually take to do something of high quality? And now let's quantify that in terms of all of the other demands. And so I think it is about salary costs, but it's also about being really quantifying time. And Cathie talked about leadership time when you're covering instability in terms generally of sort of staffing and absence. And so I think that plays into it. My personal view is that I think that the uncertainty about the labour market is one of the biggest risks and biggest unknowns that we're all facing at the moment. And I think that that plays out across multiple sectors. The 30k starting salary, modelling that through, it impacts different schools really significantly differently. And you put into that the continued existence of really quite stark regional differences and inequalities actually in terms of how schools are funded. You talk about the sort of SEM funding. That looks so different in different parts of the country. Why should it be the case that where you live as a child is going to have a significant impact on the specialist provision that you can access? But it is the case, and I hope that much of that's addressed. So I think that, yes, the 30k salary costs more generally, but I think that there's a bigger piece around quantifying time and thinking about not just what does the salary cost, but what does recruitment cost in a world where it's harder to recruit? What's the impact of the increase in starting salaries on salaries as teachers progress through their careers? And is there going to be an impact on retention, or are we going to have to see a different intervention in a few years' time to address a problem that might not be present now but could well appear? So I think it's really complex.
In terms of an unfilled vacancy, there's obviously a very obvious academic impact on that on the children. What's the funding impact of an unfilled vacancy?
It's always more expensive to cover an unfilled vacancy, and it's more expensive in many ways. It's more expensive just in terms of pure financial terms, but in terms of the sort of qualitative impact that it has on a school, and the levels of organisation, really practically, just managing to figure out how to run a school day when you've got 14 members of staff who are off. That's a really intense challenge which schools are facing day in, day out. So you have to quantify it in lots of different ways. We talk a lot about recruiting ahead of time. Actually, carrying the cost, and this is a benefit of scale, carrying the cost of recruiting just ahead of time rather than waiting until you've got a gap that you know that you can afford. And I think that there's quite a rigidity to the way that we manage staffing in education because our budgets are so constrained. One of the benefits of scale is that we can be much more flexible and dynamic in the way that we address some of those recruitment challenges. And I think we're going to have to be really imaginative going forward.
And which brings us to more money would be helpful, but the white paper didn't have any more money really in it. But it did claim to be evidence-led, Becky, and the EEF was featured throughout the white paper, saying that you are the evidence base for the white paper. Is it possible in reality to make the claim of being evidence-led because of the contextual factors you said before, because of the fact that evidence can't bring certainty? So how do you see that relationship between policy making, which we've seen in the white paper and the green paper, and this notion of evidential certainty?
Well, it's a big question there, John, but we can, of course, inform the evidence. And we can do that in two ways. We can support with the present evidence base and test policy theories and propositions to look at the evidence. And also we can, taking something like, obviously, the early career framework, we can curate the evidence that goes in to support that framework. And the EEF is working in both those ways. I mean, there's been a lot said about the white paper. I actually think that in the circumstances and given the sort of fiscal constraints and so forth, this is quite an educational white paper. It sets and charts a direction. And I was thinking coming up on the train that it's a little bit like a sort of point system at a set of rail junctions. It points us in the right path, rather than allowing steerage off into wrong directions, and keeps that path going forward clear. So I think one of the points of analysis about the white paper is that the devil's in the detail, and that's right on a whole range of fronts. But actually some of the criticism of the white paper, the points about, is it ambitious enough and so forth, I think actually in the context it is very ambitious. Probably the system couldn't withstand something hugely radical that throws everything up in the air at present, let alone the question about whether this is desirable. The four different chapters of the white paper, as they're characterised, I think are very sensible in terms of evidence, having the importance of quality teaching at the top and infusing the first chapter is exactly right in the ways that I was just talking about, and I think that that's a very impressive and important direction. And then there's a series of open doors to further clarification in the system, drawing on best practice wherever we find it, removing some of the sort of ideological barriers to that, and going harder and faster on poor quality and getting that accountability right. And all of these things, I think, are really important both for direction and for clarity.
Cathie, did you expect this white paper? Were you expecting, I mean, I know some people were expecting either the Great Recovery white paper, like this is a 4-year recovery plan, or the Great Rewrite, okay, what's Nadeem Zahawi's vision for education? This is what we're going to see. We didn't really get either of those things. What was your overall impression?
Overall, I felt it was a really sensible direction of travel, and I think Becky's absolutely right. There just isn't an appetite for some tidal wave of new coming at the sector. I think there's the way that it's set out in terms of building on things that are already in place. There is a continuity to it, which I think is welcome. So continuity around it all starts with a great teacher in front of a classroom of children. There is no golden bullet, magic bullet to this. It's that. Great teacher in front of a class of children, that's how children make progress. If there was any other way of doing it, somebody would have thought of it, that's the one. And putting that front and centre, a focus on leadership, we really welcome the expansion of the national professional qualifications. The fact now literacy, early years are recognised and funded is really welcome. I mean, there were aspects of it, I think that, you know, we probably had a wry smile to ourselves and thought, thus was it ever. Parent pledges, yes, it's a good terminology, but you know, I've not come across a school that doesn't talk to parents about children falling behind and doesn't talk to parents about what they're doing about it. That is, you know, that's what we do. So there were some aspects that felt they didn't need underlining. Whereas there are other elements around, you know, what does a strong trust look like that I think are a real call to arms for the sector to become more unified. I think what I'm experiencing as in a new CEO role is colleagues and a context which is becoming more and more collaborative, that says we're going to do better by children the more we work together, the more we break down boundaries, and really knowing that what's front and centre in a strong trust is a focus on what goes on in the classroom. It is about enabling funding to be spent on the right things. It is about strong governance. It is around civic duty, and all these things being aspects of the paper that, you know, when I read it, I felt, yes, the details got to come, and we need to not overreact to aspects that aren't fleshed out yet. But on the whole, when I talked to all the head teachers yesterday, all 60 came on a Zoom call with me. There was I think a general sort of nodding in agreement to many aspects of what we heard.
How about you, Rebecca? Do you feel that it was the white paper you wanted or needed?
I think there's a lot in it that is quite refreshing. And I think the constancy is quite refreshing. It takes quite a lot of confidence, I think, politically, to say, we've invested really significantly in these reforms around teacher training and development, and actually we're not going to move on to the next thing, we're going to embed it. Because you know, let's take the sort of ECF and the ITT review, and you know, I've been involved in the retention and recruitment strategy group for several years now. And we're trying to do something with ECF which is at a scale and a pace that we've never embarked upon before. And I think the fact that we're saying, no, we need to commit to this and do it really well, I find really refreshing. I think there is a lot in the details. You know, I've sort of spoken about that. And I think that the route through these next few months to get more detail around what it is that constitutes a strong trust, what do the trust standards look like, actually what should intelligent regulation, what form should that take? But I think that there's a real openness through the white paper to work with the sector. And I think that one of the things that was powerful and really important to me personally is this sense of purposeful collaboration, that sense of system generosity. And I think that it starts with assuming positive intent. And that's not ever saying, let's not critique, let's not put the alternative view forward. But actually it is saying, if we're going to make a system which works well for every child, then we have to be the people who are prepared to step up and create that and build that. And I think that there's enough in the white paper for us to be able to really work with. And to the point on, is it ambitious enough? When we get there, when we actually get to the magic 90, then we can probably have a conversation about where next. But actually, we're never going to get to the place where we reduce the variation that exists and the regional disparity that exists and the gap between children of disadvantage and their more affluent peers, unless we actually make a strong and confident step towards, actually perhaps this should be the threshold that we calibrate around for an adequate education system in the world's 6th largest economy. And let's get there first and then ask, where do we go next? The critique around, is it sufficiently broad, I think is really important, because I don't think it's saying just focus on literacy and numeracy. I don't think it's putting forward a sort of grad grind model of education, but that's for us as school leaders to say, you know, schools should reflect the colour and context of their communities. The experience that a child has outside of the classroom is just as impactful on the contribution that they're going to make throughout their adult lives as what they experience in the classroom. But that actually fundamental literacy and numeracy, that is the currency of choice and opportunity, and I think that we shouldn't shy away from saying there should be a high bar for all young people.
Mm. And the other thing about the white paper that struck me is that a lot of this white paper is going to be procured, and the SEND paper even more so. So these are ambitious in terms of the scale of the logistical side of it. Do you think the government procurement system can cope, Caroline?
No. I'd agree with everything everybody said actually about the white paper. I think I like your term, Becca, about embedding, and I think actually it's a very sensible ministerial team that doesn't go for the temptation of new all the time and actually works on where we're coming from. So I think that's very positive. But from the point of, you know, the procurement angle and the elements that my members are expert on, rather than the teachers in that, you're all experts, but the directly impact on my membership, I think it's probably 2 out of 3. So I don't know if that's a B+. I don't know what's in old money. When new money is a level 5 or 6, I think very right to have sort of the digital standards as that kind of basically a catch-all net for schools. Good to work towards the infrastructure. Until you get those right, actually procuring anything is a bit pointless until you get the kind of the building blocks. But the procurement, it's not fit for purpose currently. I am very, very worried. I think Becky made the good point about the vast majority of the white paper being very well evidenced, but the section that talks about, which will have the majority of procurements about curriculum resources, is based on a 2018 report of 40 schools before the pandemic. So going back to actually the purpose of why you would have centralised curriculum resources hasn't been evidence-based. There hasn't been any market analysis of how it would impact schools or the commercial providers that provide those resources, and that is incredibly worrying. Last year, the department had to pull an in-class tender resource precisely for the point that it wasn't based in evidence on the last day of that tender, because they hadn't looked at the market impact and the evidence. And I really worry that if we carry on moving forward with the plans for a new arm's length body at the moment, we could end up in national tutor programme territory in the future. And I do think it's really important that we work through schools and the sector and government to make sure that proposals are evidenced properly before we move to the actual point of procurement, before it's too late.
It seems like a good point now, before we finish, to sort of, we've talked a lot about the issues schools are facing. If I come to each of you and say, you know, in the next 3 months, which one is the most important for you? Which one is the issue that you think is the one that will be foremost in your mind, or might keep you up at night, for example? I'm going to go with you, Cathie, first.
It's got to be about retaining the great teachers and what goes on in the classroom. We've been through a huge upheaval as a planet, as a country, as a sector, and the individual stories of, you know, the loss and just the struggle that people have had, you know, through their lives. I think people are reappraising what they want from their lives, and what we, I think, as school leaders need to do is to re-inject that passion into people about what brought them into the profession. You know, I'm making a really deliberate point in my first 3 months in the job to reach out to every individual teacher, to start talking more into schools so that there is that, you know, hopefully a kind of golden thread of vision that's, you know, through the school leaders, but, you know, directly from me and from the board, which is about, you know, there is purpose to what we do. It matters. You know, you're the answer to these children, and trying to keep that whole flow of great people coming in, great people staying. You know, I had a lovely conversation with a school leader just last week in Bexley Heath. She began when the school joined the trust as a newly qualified teacher, and she's just become a head. It's those sorts of stories that we've just got to keep telling, so that there's this sense of we're going to come out of this. There's going to be some big pivot points along the way, but, you know, we can do it.
Caroline?
I think it's from a professional, with my professional hat on, it's got to be about proper consultation and proper procurement and proper evidence analysis of the impact of curriculum reform and the arm's length body. With a personal hat on, very much agree with Cathie about maintaining and thinking about the well-being of teachers because they've come through such a challenging time. It's about how do we support them and all the good work they do.
Becky?
For me, it's the focus on that social disadvantage gap that's so well evidenced, and we know has grown through the pandemic. We've got the pupil premium, which is a wonderful mechanism to approach that from a school's basis at least, and keeping that firmly focused on socially disadvantaged kids, I think, is really important.
And Bex?
I'm going to bring us back to children, because I just think that we've got an incredible generation of young people in our schools who've been through something you know, that has the power to be incredibly disruptive for the rest of their lives. But I think that they equally have the power and the potential to turn it into a force for good. And so for me, it's the focus on making sure that our young people feel a sense of real agency, building on the work of that our Children's Commissioner launched through the big conversation, that we are creating this new future together, making sure that we pragmatically do all that we can to close the gaps, particularly for those young people who've got less time remaining in school, but that we also hold on to a more energetic and colourful vision for what a brilliant education and experience at school looks like. Because, you know, life hasn't really been lived in Technicolor for the last few years. And I think we've got a real opportunity to launch into the next decade with a sort of different and bolder and brighter perspective. And we should listen to our young people in shaping that.
I think that's a really positive point to finish on. I'd like to thank the whole panel for joining in this discussion, and in May we will have a similar discussion around SEND and the SEND Green Paper that we've mentioned today. But for now, thank you very much.